Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for having me, Sheikh Tabriz. Wassalamu alaikum to you all. Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا من فضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم بارك لنا في رجب وشعبان وبلغنا رمضان. آمين. I am coming to you all today from my childhood home here in Los Angeles. So depending on where you are, it is much earlier for me. But I'm very excited to share what has been a project a few years in the works now, and was the subject of my dissertation at Oxford. And my project began really with a very simple and theoretical almost question, one that's common to all legal traditions. And that question is essentially, when can a judge or a jurist use their own sense of what's right, what's fair, or what's good, or what's moral, to justify either, you could say, overruling the law in a particular case, or sort of doing something that the strict letter of the law doesn't seem like it requires. And in pursuing this question on a very general level, I quickly found that the history of Istihsan in the early Hanafi school contained truly remarkable potential for understanding the debate around this issue in the earliest years of Islamic history, as well as other many fundamental questions of early Islamic legal history, which hopefully we'll be exploring together today, inshallah. But just to begin with some basics, before we delve into, there's many offshoots of the topic, and we'll try to stay on one track and stay focused. So, people often ask, what is Istihsan? And it's an old debate, because much of the Hanafi literature, especially in the 10th and 11th century, we mentioned Al-Jassas and the wonderful class that's going to be taught on the Fusul. In that long work, Al-Jassas, in discussing Istihsan, goes very deeply into what exactly is its definition. Much of the debate has been around the definition of the term. What exactly does it mean? For many, it typically evokes this dilemma that I spoke of the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. So usually when people think Istihsan, they think, you could look, as I have on the slide here, to instances like the early ruling of the Khalifa Umar ibn al-Khattab, when, for example, he suspended the penalty for theft, the had penalty for theft in a year of famine, and this other very famous case, the Himariya, where he awarded someone inheritance who, strictly speaking, didn't seem like they should get inheritance, but because they were a closer relative, it seemed like they should. And so this, obviously, those cases of the Khalifa Umar are not, are not cases of Istihsan. The term was not used, but this is what people think usually when they think Istihsan, and the Western literature especially. And that is what Hanafis were often criticized for, that Istihsan was used as a sort of outlet for non-legal reasoning, you could say. Now, one can see right away the controversial subjectivity at issue with these types of rulings. Who is qualified to decide when to suspend, for example, the had penalty for theft? Is it only the Khalifa? When can a jurist make that type of decision in a given time and place, or even more broadly? How do you know what reasons are good enough to justify departing from the strict letter of the law in any given situation? Questions abound. And these questions, through Istihsan, became a very, what I think I've found, became a core early controversy in early Islamic law, with Abu Hanifa and his disciples using Istihsan profusely in early, the earliest Hanafi doctrine, and only then for a Shafi'i to appear and famously declare Istihsan haram, and then many debates for the next century or two afterwards that are actually much sort of less discussed. The debates between Al-Shafi'i and Al-Jassas, there's 150 or 200 years there, and we know very little in general about what theoretical discourse and usul al-fiqh looked like at that time. And my preliminary findings show that the debate around Istihsan, and not just Istihsan as a word, but this conceptual idea of who can overrule the law and when and for what reason, was a core controversy of the time. So let's start at the beginning, or actually one more framing question. What many people having heard my introduction, will be thinking, what about these many other terms that are at least associated with this debate? Darura, necessity, is often a reason cited for departing from the law. Maslaha, maqasid al-sharia, many of these terms. I feel like istihsan is uniquely superior as a way to get at the question that we want to study, especially for early Hanafism, for a couple of reasons. One of them, it's just sort of the least discussed with regards to this theoretical question. Maslaha and ijtihad and maqasid al-sharia have been discussed thoroughly over the past century at least. It's the oldest of these terms in terms of its prominence as a technical legal term, and relatedly as used in actual fiqh, as opposed to usul al-fiqh. So you read the Hanafi works of fiqh, and istihsan is coming up all the time. Whereas terms like maslaha in a technical sense are really later usul terminology. That's my impression. Of course, we have many Hanafi experts here with us who can correct me on that if I'm wrong. So to jump into the early years, I find that we first see the term istihsan as a technical term appear in mid-8th century Kufa. And to understand istihsan, then we have to understand the logic of early Iraqi law. And this is something that Sheikh Suhail Hanif, as well as a famous Western academic of Islamic law, Ahmed al-Shamsi, have both recently thought about and argued. And they've said that 8th century Iraqi law was uniquely characterized by its focus on analogical consistency between rulings. And Suhail Hanif calls it a system of rules that complement other established rules. The idea being that God's law, the Sharia, should be coherent and consistent. It should all the rulings should fit together to form an eloquent whole. One story in particular illustrates what they mean here. And this is it's a very famous story of the early period, in which two Medinan jurists, very prominent jurists of Medina, are at the beginning of the 8th century, even very early, discussing the blood money for a woman's finger. If you were to injure a woman such that she loses a finger, how much you must pay in compensation. And the student, Rabi'a, asks his teacher, Sa'id ibn al-Musayyab, what is the blood money for a single finger? Sa'id responds, 10 camels, 2 fingers, 20 camels, 3 fingers, 30 camels, 4 fingers, and at this point, Sa'id responds, 20 camels. Famously, Rabi'a stops and asks why, when her wound is now greater, does her blood money go down? And Sa'id's famous response to that is, are you an Iraqi? That is the sunnah, my son or my nephew, is what he says in the Arabic. And so the story elegantly shows that even at the very beginning of the 8th century, or if the story is not exactly accurate, at least by the mid-8th century when it's being reported, it was characteristically Iraqi to follow analogical consistency to its end. 10, 20, 30, therefore 40, even if it's in potential disregard of the sunnah. And what the sunnah means at this time is, of course, we don't have the hadith compilations yet, so what exactly the sunnah is a debated category, but some conception of athar, even of the tabi'i generation or of the sahaba, but just allegiance to a known practice of the earlier generation versus analogical, following the law analogically consistently. And so you could say that the prototypical difference between the Iraqis and the Medinans at this time would be that the Iraqis would go for 40 and the Medinans would go for 20. Istihsan in this framework is the exception that proves the rule. So istihsan connoted any departure from analogical reasoning for any reason. And this is, I think, what's key. When we often talk about istihsan as meaning, allowing a departure for darura, for ease, for lenience, making things easy on people, which is oftentimes what its conception is, that's missing the point that istihsan is the description for the logical move from one ruling to another, not the description for the reason why you're moving. And this is why the term is also different from a term like maslaha or darura. Those speak about reasons, but you can do istihsan for any reason. So in that, the Medinan camels example, you're doing istihsan, you're turning away from the qiyas ruling to another ruling, but you're doing it because of athar, you're doing it because of sunnah. You're departing from a qiyas to a different ruling because of what the sunnah is telling you to do. Or you could depart because of darura, or you could depart, and there's many other words that we'll get into later. And we see this reflected in the very earliest reported mentions of istihsan as a technical legal term. Linguistically, of course, it's prominently used in other fields. In poetry, ما استحسن من شعره, or things to that effect, are what's beautiful of his poetry, or what the poets love of his poetry. So it's the word itself is found very early on in Arabic. But in a technical legal sense, we see some of its first mentions in the famous judge Iyas ibn Muawiyah and the famous statesman Ibn al-Mutaffa, specifically to mean departing from qiyas. And there was a debate going on in this century about even the validity of qiyas and the potential negative effects of qiyas. So at this point, the real question becomes, for the early Iraqis, Abu Hanifa and his students, what kinds of reasons justify istihsan? As we said, it could be many reasons. And as Shafi'i said that many of those reasons were subjective. Many of those reasons were just out of disrespect for proper, what we now think of as proper usul procedures. And is that true? Does that hold up? And when would an Iraqi jurist depart from the law derived through qiyas? So that was what you could say is my empirical project. To answer this question, I went through every istihsan ruling that I could find in the Kitab al-Asl of Muhammad al-Shaybani. I found about 500 cases, which is surprisingly few for the Kitab al-Asl, which is of course tomes and tomes, tens of thousands of rulings probably. I found only about 500. This was with, no surprise, sort of a shamila word search of 50 variations of the word istihsan. So this is by no means comprehensive. But to the extent that says something, it's actually a surprisingly small part of the Hanafi corpus for the amount of attention that it's received. But it's, as I say, the exception that proves the rule, because it shows something very important going on. It shows the outer bounds of the reasoning, so to speak, and it becomes a major controversy. So I'm mainly interested in the study. I collected various aspects of each ruling. So for example, which jurist mentioned it, which jurist was reported to have opposed it. These are all code letters. It's, not a very advanced spreadsheet here. But I'm most interested in this column, which is the reason why the jurist departed from the qiyas to the istihsan. In total, I find about 70 reasons. You can see that I ran out of English letters, so I had to turn to Arabic, and then I ran out of Arabic letters, and I turned to symbols and exclamation marks and so on. So truly many reasons. Some of these reasons are the more objective and standard usul procedures. And this is the defense that the al-Jassas and all the classical Hanafis give of istihsan. They say that Ash-Shafi'i misunderstood the term, that he took it to mean turning away from qiyas for some kinds of subjective reasons, and the Hanafis say no, it's the classical Hanafis say no, it's turning away from qiyas for another qiyas, or for ijma' or Quran or sunnah or so on. And indeed, this is the most common reason. Turning away from qiyas for another qiyas is, I find, the most common usage of istihsan. And also here, athar or hadith, the sunnah in general category, is one of the top reasons. Notably, ijma' does not appear. This lines up with earlier debates about how solid of a category ijma' was at this time. The term ijma' only appears in one short passage of the Kitab al-Asl that I found, at least, and it seems quite clear from context that was at least not reflective of the Shaybani himself. That was one of his students or his student's student. And we know this of the Asl already. We know that many sections of the Asl are not penned by a Shaybani. I mean, many of them start with, as early books do, I heard from my teacher as Shaybani. Some of them have other names as the author. So we know that this is, what a book is at the time is open and controversial. And this is a compilation of students' notes, some original writings probably by a Shaybani, others by his students. But it's taken to be a pretty good indication of the doctrine of a Shaybani, and he's reporting many of the other jurist rulings as well of the early period. So as I said, we have a couple of standard usul procedures. We then have many reasons that are stereotypically associated with istihsan as leniency. And, those pop up all over the place. An interesting and prominent one, for example, is, necessity, darura. It's not a big surprise. Custom, urf, that you'll just ease up on a ruling a little bit because the urf is somewhat different. this one same end goal wrong procedure is what I've called it, is essentially when you've structured the transaction in a way that doesn't exactly have each step being valid, but you're essentially getting at the same end result. So istihsan, and we'll say that, that the transaction is valid. These are no big surprises, any of these reasons, is usually what istihsan is associated with. But what I'm particularly interested in is this other category of istihsan rulings, which are reasons associated with what you could call stringency. When something is not fard, but the Hanafi jurists say istihsanan, it is fard. Or something is not haram, and the Hanafi jurists say no, istihsanan, it is haram. And they're essentially creating legal obligations where by qiyas there were no legal obligations. And you could call that the opposite of lenience. We see that a large number of reasons appear in this category. Some of them we know, and it's sort of like we just haven't categorized them in this way to realize that there's a conceptual difference here. But for example, precaution, ihtiyat, is a famous sort of concept that comes up in Hanafi fiqh. For example, that you technically don't need to make up this prayer by qiyas, but ihtiyatan, we're going to say that it's fard in the Hanafi madhab for you to make up this prayer. Another very interesting one, which is actually the most common that I found, appropriate or tasteful, good decorum is what you could call it, is when something would be socially unseemly. An example that's given of this is why is it fard to pray Salatul Janazah standing as opposed to sitting or riding? Because it's a nafil optional prayer, like other nafil optional prayers, by qiyas, you could say that one should have the option to choose to pray it sitting or to choose to pray it riding, as in on an animal in travel. And in the Kitab al-Asl, they say that this is qabih, that it's unseemly for someone to be, it just doesn't do justice to a janazah, for someone to be sitting or riding, essentially disrespecting the prayer. And there's also a shade of course, there's no reported mention of anyone ever praying Salatul Janazah sitting for no valid reason. And so there's also, you could say, a tinge of sunnah in there as well. And you can see reasons are certainly not exclusive. Multiple reasons can occur at once. But there was definitely a sense, and this comes across very strongly in other rulings where the Hanafi jurists depart from qiyas knowingly because something just seems unseemly if you were to make that ruling, and closing legal loopholes, and ensuring people cannot abuse the laws, and that they don't achieve unjust ends through legally correct means. You could say it's almost the opposite of hiyal, the opposite of sort of the legal stratagems which allow you to achieve ends through legal transactions. They don't want some of those to be possible, and they say istihsan, and that's haram. So this is a surprising result to me, but when we look at the debate that occurs in the 9th century, this category of istihsan is extremely critical, and we'll get to it soon, inshallah. What do we know, though, just reflecting now at the data set, sort of this shot of istihsan as a whole in the Kitab al-Asl? We know that yes, istihsan does contrast with qiyas almost 100% of the time. The classical Hanafis are absolutely correct on that when they say so. And even these no cases, there's a side explanation. It's essentially not the same technical usage of the word istihsan. It's sort of a different connotation of the word istihsan that we don't have to worry about for our purposes. Does istihsan connote lenience, which is what it's usually associated with? I say resoundingly no. It's actually lenience in a minority of cases. Some, it's just not possible to really say, is this lenient or strict? It's just a different ruling. And in a good chunk of cases, it's actually more strict. Finally, what I find very interesting is, as I said, I was sort of collecting if a ruling is attributed to a certain jurist, who is it attributed to? And we can break down the usage of istihsan across at least the Hanafi forefathers. And you see that the stereotypical narrative of Abu Hanifa using istihsan the most, but also using it the most subjectively, actually seems to bear out in Kitab al-Asl, where the reported uses of istihsan go down over time. The reported opposition to an earlier istihsan ruling by the later figures goes up over time. Of course, this could be an artifact. These scholars are later, so of course they have more objections to earlier rulings. It's unclear what istihsan rulings Abu Hanifa would even be objecting to, but he had some to object to apparently. But when you look at the types of reasoning at play, that also bears out in the data, that the types of reasoning being used by Abu Hanifa are more often the more subjective types of reasoning. Ash-Shaybani, most of his uses are sort of qiyas to alternative qiyas type of thing, although he's still using some of the types of reasoning that would later get the Hanafis into trouble. We can skip this for our purposes. So that takes me to what I find extremely exciting, which is we have now this doctrine which has a large portion of istihsan rulings that later thinkers, especially Ash-Shafi'i, would find problematic. So Ash-Shafi'i famously declares istihsan haram. He says both in the Risala and the it's clear that it is haram for anyone to rule according to istihsan. That's a rough translation. And then his other very famous statement, man istahsana faqad shara'a. Whoever uses istihsan, it's as if they've created sharia. It's as if they were doing tashri', legislating. And you can see that this is particularly applicable to that category of rulings in which istihsan is being made, istihsan is making the law more stringent, making a haram out of what was not haram, or making a fard out of what was not fard. And this also maps onto Ash-Shafi'i's actual arguments for ibtal al-istihsan in his famous kitab ibtal al-istihsan in the Well, the first two arguments that he gives are not specific to that category. He says that istihsan is so subjective that it would just allow the law to be too different in, every juris could have their own law, every city could have its own law. If you were allowed juris to sort of use istihsan ungrounded by dalil, ungrounded by, strict obedience to qiyas. And so, God's law just cannot be that uniform, that disparate. And secondly, that only scholars can make law. It's a very interesting logical argument where he's saying, if a scholar can use istihsan, why can't anyone use istihsan? What makes a scholar's istihsan different? Because istihsan doesn't rely upon dalil or any sort of knowledge that one has. And what makes a scholar is that knowledge. So if a scholar's istihsan is valid, why not anyone else's? And he says, and that's clearly absurd. Only a scholar should be able to declare what the law is. These second two are specifically geared to the category of istihsan that makes the law more stringent. And that's because in this first one, Ash-Shafi'i says that law must be based on a khabar lazim, on a khabar as in a piece of evidence, almost a dalil, you could say, some kind of report, or a qiyas could count as a khabar, it's unclear, but something that, because a qiyas is based upon a dalil, a hadith or something that actually creates the ruling in question. So you cannot say that something is haram unless you have a khabar to resort to, or a qiyas to a khabar to resort to. And that was obviously particularly problematic for many of the Hanafi rulings that were istihsan because of decorum. What khabar does decorum get to? Or urf in general, it's not really a khabar in that sense. And Shafi'i has his own complicated theory of urf, but in this sense, he's clearly angling at and cites some of the istihsan rulings that make the law more stringent. They, shara'a, they do tashri', they make sharia with no khabar to undergird them. And secondly, that law must be based on al-zahir. And al-hukm bil-zahir is a section of the as well. And he says that, and this is all within the kitab ibtal al-istihsan, so it's arguing specifically against istihsan. And he's saying that you should not and cannot judge transactions or people based on what you think their intentions might be. So you cannot close legal loopholes because you're worried people will abuse them. And he brings actually very beautiful Quranic proofs. For example, that the Quran commanded that the munafiqun, the hypocrites, still be treated as Muslim. The idea that if someone is buying a sword to murder someone, the transaction is still valid. That if someone marries someone intending to divorce them, that absent any strict evidence to that effect, the marriage is itself valid, even though the person has committed a haram act, and so on. And so he's saying we have all these cases, these rulings where even when we know that something is corrupt internally, for example, the munafiqun, we're still ordered to treat them as they appear on the zahir. And he says for istihsan, then, you cannot declare that something is haram just because you're worried that someone's going to use, with bad intentions, going to abuse that law. So in making these arguments, what I'm interested in is if early Iraqi doctrine is full of istihsan, and if a Shafi'i declares istihsan haram, where are the voices of the other early Iraqis, the students of Ash-Shaybani and Abu Yusuf and later Hanafis, responding to a Shafi'i on the topic? The first response that we really think of as a response is al-Jassas 200 years later. There must have been something in the meantime. And we do find, and I think I have found some very exciting responses, specifically extremely tailored to Shafi'i's arguments here, making it clear that people had read to and responded to the Kitab al-Ibtal al-Istihsan in Baghdad in this, in Shafi'i's lifetime or soon after his death. The first of these figures is Bishr al-Marisi, of course, an extremely controversial figure. He was a prominent student of Abu Yusuf. Biographical reports say that he was considered one of the foremost jurists in Baghdad after the death of Abu Yusuf and al-Shaybani. So he's one of the major Hanafis of the, you could say, second generation. Obviously, though, according to biographical reports, he was also a Zindiq. There are many reports of people saying that he should be hung, he should be crucified, he should be beheaded, and this is because of some of his thoughts on kalam. Interestingly, the biographical reports tell of a very close personal relationship between Bishr and al-Shafi'i. Reportedly, they first met at Hajj. Bishr witnessed al-Shafi'i debate Muhammad al-Shaybani. Bishr and the Iraqis went down to Hajj together, subhanAllah. So Muhammad al-Shaybani and Bishr went to Hajj together, and Muhammad al-Shaybani debated al-Shafi'i at Hajj. The specific masjid is mentioned, the specific historian who wrote this down is mentioned, and Bishr witnessed it, and afterwards he famously said that, somebody asked him, what did you think of your companion compared to ours? And he said, your companion was riding atop the crest of the ocean, and ours was merely gargling with its froth. Shaybani being the gargler, and Shafi'i being riding on its crest. When Bishr returns to Baghdad, he's reported to have been one of the people to spread word of Shafi'i before Shafi'i's arrival. He famously said, when doing that, I met a man at Mecca who has half of all of humanity's intelligence, meaning Shafi'i. When Shafi'i comes to Baghdad, he stays with Bishr al-Marisi as his guest until, in a very funny story, or just, subhanAllah, the things you can find about our tradition in the works of history, Bishr's mother comes to Shafi'i and asks him, what are you doing hanging out with this heretic, essentially? At which point Shafi'i goes and speaks to Bishr. They have a conversation. He's saying, why are you saying these things about theology? And they have a back and forth, and eventually Shafi'i chooses to leave Bishr's home, and he goes and stays with someone else. So and then they have later encounters. SubhanAllah, the historical data on this is just fascinating. Of course, biographical evidence we always have to take with a grain of salt, but the detail is stunning, and it seems to bear out in Bishr's fiqh. So when we can look at Bishr's fiqh, we don't have existing books of fiqh from him, but we have reported rulings of him in later works of Hanafi fiqh. He's actually one of the most cited Hanafis, other than the Hanafi founders, in later works of fiqh, at least among the top 5 or top 10, which is surprising. And he's usually cited because he almost always rejects the Istihsan opinion of the Hanafi madhab. So there's one famous case where if you have a well in which an impurity falls, a najasa, how many buckets of water do you have to take out of the well to make it pure? Some say 3, some say 7, some say 10. Bishr says it'll never be pure. Destroy the well and dig another one. And this is his rejection of istihsan for any reason. And this is interesting because the istihsan of the Hanafis here is not even based on darura, you could say. For some cases, darura appears as the reason, but in others, it's just based on athar. Sayyidina Ali it was reported to have said, you take out a certain number of buckets, I forget whether it was 3 or 7. Many of the Sahaba and Tabi'is have reports about what to do in this situation. And Bishr has very strict opinions about another controversy at this time, which is accepting the khabar al-wahid, the singularly transmitted hadith or report. So he rejects the khabar al-wahid, which a Shafi'i does not do, but he rejects istihsan, which a Shafi'i does do. Therefore, he ends up rejecting many istihsan rulings of the early Hanafi madhab, sometimes to get into these very impractical situations like the well and a few others. And it's almost as if he's being cited in later Hanafi works as this sort of stock, here's the istihsan opinion, here's the variations on it, and then of course we have Bishr who rejects the istihsan. So the question is, what makes Bishr a Hanafi if he's rejecting istihsan and rejects also the khabar al-wahid, which is a little more controversial in the Hanafi school? There's just very interesting idea of this Hanafi figure that we should examine a little closer. And then, just because we are running out of time, I'll move a little more quickly. This second line of responses, which I find truly fascinating, you have to sort of break down the reasoning of the classical Hanafi defense of Istihsan. Shafi'i says Istihsan is subjective, therefore it is invalid. The classical Hanafis respond, Istihsan is not subjective, therefore it is valid. There is a middle party of people in this 9th and 10th century who say Istihsan is subjective. You are correct, Imam al-Shafi'i, but that subjectivity is necessary to the proper functioning of the law. How can you have a good law if we cannot use our sense of what's right and what's good and what is just to make sure that the law is being applied in a good way? And this chain of thinkers seem to originate in Basra. I tend to call them the radical Basrins because they have some truly shocking arguments that do not survive into classical usul al-fiqh literature. The earliest of these figures is what seems to me Muwais ibn Imran. And here we get into this very interesting debate about the birth of the field of usul al-fiqh. When was the field born? You know, who founded it? Devin Stewart, a Western academic of Islamic law, says that from the earliest works of usul al-fiqh that we have, they seem to be sort of Shafi'i affiliated responses to some group of Hanafis who are not cited in later Hanafi usul literature, or Iraqis at least. And Istihsan is a key area of dispute because all of the earliest works of Shafi'i leaning usul fiqh that we have from the 9th and 10th centuries have chapters on Istihsan in them. And it seems like this could be the party of people that those works are in response to. So we have Muwais ibn Imran, his student Al-Jahid, the famous literateur, who now we know had a very strong understanding. He read Shafi'i's law and legal theory. He knew Shafi'i's categories of, for example, hadith categorization and other theories and other works. It's just absolutely clear. And we know that as well because there was for a long time rumored to be a kitab fi usul al-futya by Al-Jahid. We were not sure whether that was a work of usul al-fiqh. A recent publication within 2 years of a kitab al-maqalat by Al-Balkhi has extended portions of Al-Jahid's kitab usul al-futya, and it is absolutely certainly a work of like legal theory. It seems to look like usul al-fiqh. And so we have very well developed legal theory coming out in mid-9th century Iraq, which we haven't had evidence of this before. Al-Jahid reports the arguments of Muwais ibn Imran saying scholars should be allowed to make law without dalil. That a scholar can become of their had, of their moral state, and they're being guided by God and their encyclopedic knowledge of law and other things, that eventually they reach a state where they can start making law, not having to cite to a khabar lazim, as a Shafi'i says, not having to cite to a dalil, using their sense of what's right or wrong. Not just right or wrong, but many considerations, all these considerations. And we have even later speakers who come up, very interestingly developing these arguments further, bringing Quranic proofs, saying, there's verses about, these are the people guided by God upon whom is light, and so on. That class must certainly be the scholars, and their guidance is not just strictly intellectual, logical guidance. Discussions of ilham come into play. The idea that scholars eventually, and the awliya especially, eventually start gaining access to ilham as a form of, sorting between legal rulings. And this is just, a fascinating line of argument. And they start bringing logical arguments as well. And there seems to be a back and forth. So we have a line of fingers here that don't even get cited by people like Al-Jassas and the classical Hanafis. Although when you look at the words of Al-Jassas, Abu Zayd al-Dabusi, another later Hanafi usul thinker, and others, if we look at their chapters on ilham, not their chapters on istihsan, those chapters on ilham are usually not long chapters because ilham is not a very prominent legal category. But when they have certain sections on ilham, which they do, they end up bringing up the arguments which in this century were happening within the word istihsan. So it's a very interesting sort of migration of the debate to outside of strictly legal terms, because I think at this point, the Hanafis, everyone had sort of agreed that this idea, other proofs against it were just too strong. The idea of a law that one can make without dalil just wasn't going to hold up. And we can skip this last category because we're running out of time. So my conclusions from this are, I hope that this has shown the window into many of the early issues of Islamic legal history that we can analyze through better understanding the usage of istihsan by the early Iraqis. One of them we didn't even get into much is the combination of law with theology, tahsin and tatbih, and Mu'tazilism in general at this time, and tahsin and taqbih aqli, whether you can do that rationally or whether it must be by revelation, is a major debate of this time. And you can see how it closely relates to, okay, if you think tahsin and taqbih aqli are possible, if you think you can make these decisions in a rational way, then why you should also be able to then change the law because of that. And so there's a clear interrelation here happening. And again, sort of on the historical point, where are the earliest works of usul al-fiqh? Who were their authors? What were their names? What did they argue? I think hopefully this research has shown some of what they argued, even if after Muwais ibn Imran and al-Jahid, I'm still a little short on names and works, names of works. So secondly, many people will then ask me, what does this mean for Islam in the modern era? Oftentimes, Istihsan has been used as this sort of reformist, platform. The idea that, it's from the Islamic tradition that we used to adjust the law out of recognition of social reality and practicality. Therefore, we should want to do so again today. Sort of, bring Istihsan back, the forgotten principle, you could say. I certainly do not think that's what Istihsan means, because as I've shown, Istihsan means a range of things, sometimes lenience, sometimes stringency. What it gets at, I think, is a more fundamental debate about who do we believe has the proper judgment and wisdom and intuition to make decisions about when to make sort of exceptions, you could say, from the law, or when it is really proper for the qiyas ruling on the books to change. If there is a darura, who can declare that a darura is important enough and grave enough? And of course, this is very relevant to, for example, even from the early 20th century, the debates around financial interest. Famously, many scholars argued that Muslims were poor and the Muslim world was inferior to the West. And if we don't start transacting with riba with Western countries, we will forever remain poor and inferior to the West. And therefore, we must allow at least certain less egregious forms of it. Now, 100 years later, we can see that there are other repercussions of that. The entire global system has now changed. There is no scope of global economy that now operates outside of the presence of riba. Whether if a quarter of the world's population, us Muslims, had stood firmly against that, maybe we would have seen the hikmah underlying that too. And so this just, we would have avoided kind of the situation that we're in today. And therefore, this shows the real subjectivity at play and how even very grave, that's not a light darura, but even very grave darura who can decide to make that call. And so I hope that has been beneficial, inshallah. And as I hope it was clear as well. And I stand to be corrected. My fiqh is not advanced. I have not done the amazing course that Irshad is putting on and read through, the 5 Hanafi texts, and therefore I might even just be factually incorrect on some things. So I welcome any comments and criticism and feedback, both in this session and inshallah, by email. You can find me. Jazakallah khair. Thank you all.